Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people. Very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a radio show about anti-fascism. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And we are joined today by Alexander Reid Ross, the author of Against The Fascist Creep and a fellow at the Centre for Analysis of the Radical Right and, according to Glenn Greenwald, a total poser. How are you, Alexander?
Yeah. Ouch, burn, sick burn. I think I got him back, in the hallway. I knocked the books out of his hand.
Why are you feuding with Glenn Greenwald?
Glenn's a special character. He just jumped into a thread that I had going on Twitter about people who have tried to censor me and then call for media freedom when it comes to specific actors. And he got brought up and he jumped in there and he was like, actually, anti-fascists are the real fascists because they're trying to put people they disagree with in jail. And, you're just a LARPer who is a poser and doesn't, cause any real threat to the system. And of course, people just piled on him and they're like, you're not scaring anybody by, going on Tucker Carlson's show, by openly admitting that you want to do PR for the Russian government, you're not really making Putin quake in his boots, So it's just silly to watch him, try to rodeo clown his way around Twitter. He just gets a pie in the face.
I'm sort of familiar with Greenwald. I know he has a history, and I think he was a lawyer at some point and defended various fairly well-known personalities, but has now become a journalist and is, doing his thing. I mean, beyond the kind of, who's a poser and who's not, I also identify him with a certain form of anti-imperialist politics, which you, I think, have critiqued in the past. Can you speak a little bit to that? And what do you think are well, you've mentioned Russia, but what do you think are the points of conflict in these perspectives on contemporary politics?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I'd like to note at this point that I'm sitting here with two good friends of mine, Hugh and Nicole from Canada. And they're Canadian, so they'll be very polite. But they've got some feelings about this kind of thing, too. They run a comic book publisher called Ad Astra that everybody should look at. It's really great, radical stuff. Education and revolutionary politics and all wholesome things. But yeah, no, we've chatted about this kind of thing all the time. It's just a question of whether anti-imperialism really strikes at power or whether it actually defends a certain formulation of power. What do you think, Hugh?
Well, there's this kind of phantom limb syndrome, it feels like, with some of these older guys, right? I don't know what motivates someone as young as Ben Norton to, get into the fray and really go to bat for Putin. But when you look at, in Canada, we have the same Communist Party we've had since 1921, and they've been fairly unswerving in their support of Russia even since the end of the Russian Revolution. And I think that there's, a lot of smaller sects, like one or two weird trot sects, but most Stalinists who will just unapologetically go to bat for Russia or China, and then Maoists will also get in there for Syria or any Ba'athist or crypto-Ba'athist regime that's still kicking around at this point. And I guess it's just about this Manichaean conception of the world as being made up of a big good and a big evil, and the U.S. is the great Satan, and you have to be on the other side, and that means you have to stand with whoever is objectively anti-imperialist. But it's so reductive. It's like a little... I understand how like teenagers get sucked into thinking like that when they just like encounter this tanky stuff on Twitter, but adult journalists who are building careers like Max Blumenthal or Ben Norton, I don't know what's going through their minds that motivates them to sort of fall in line and support the Kremlin.
Maybe it's the money. I don't know.
Is the money that good?
Yeah. Who knows? I know I'm getting my Soros checks. They accuse me of being like an MI6 field agent or some stuff. Like, yeah, they've got such like brilliant theories. It's just hilarious.
I mean, one thing that strikes me in these conversations is they reach a particular pitch, I guess, in terms of Syria and so on. But as an anarchist, I'm reasonably familiar with these kinds of debates going back a very long way. And so it seems kind of like, for me, there's a bit of deja vu. It's like, and it's perplexing in the sense that I'm in neither camp and I'm actually opposed to both in a manner of speaking. So I find some of the contemporary discussions problematic also because they're not particularly well informed historically in terms of the history of the left, labour movements, and so on and so forth. But, that's not really why we've asked you on the show, have we, Cam? No. You've written Against the Fascist Creep, and you've talked. There's several dimensions to it, and one is to do with fascist discourse and fascist ideas entering the political mainstream, and the other is that space that's created, which is what I'm referring to now, a kind of red-brown nexus, which is also productive for fascist thought and movement. So maybe you could, maybe this is a way of segueing into a discussion about exactly what is the fascist creep and where do you see evidence of it occurring today?
Yeah, I mean, so I think fascism emerged in the 1910s to encompass left-wing positions within a far right-wing sort of national revolutionary program. So you have these concepts of revolution in service of the counter-revolution. And you have the manipulation of different trends that were happening at the time, both cultural and political. So like ecology or futurism, where fascists were able to draw in interested sort of members of the intelligentsia, students, artists, and that sort of thing. And this basically became fascism's way of recruiting for a cause that is pretty nebulous and doesn't really have a core organizing principle outside of ultranationalism. And so the question is, if you just represent ultranationalism, why not just, be an old-time reactionary? And so fascists basically just sort of tried to pump this sort of youthful vision into old-time reactionary politics and the counter-revolution to sort of make it palatable for the younger generation, especially at that time that was just getting out of World War I, had fought and felt like they deserved a bigger piece of the pie, and bitterly rejected the liberal sort of centrist position that was putting down the socialists. So fascists thought, well, the liberals are terrible and the socialists are too weak to do anything, so we're going to step in and beat the hell out of the socialists, take their place, and then, basically grapple with the liberals until fascists obtain power through parliamentary means and then through a dictatorship. And what remains essential to fascism after sort of Hitler took over the power center of the ideology and steered it more towards this sort of conservative rural anti-Semitism and German ultranationalism, was this sort of attempt to bring left-wing politics into a radical politics of the far right. And that kind of movement through like Otto Strasser, who basically went into exile during the Nazi reign, or through Julius Evola, who was the notorious Italian sort of occult theorist, and his disciples in the New Order, or the National Vanguard in Italy, who were notorious for bombing civilian targets or assassinating journalists or judges and that sort of thing, working with the CIA or various factions of the Italian secret services. Through all of that, you get this common thread of this idea of national revolution, this sort of co-opting of left-wing counterculture a lot of the time, as the good essay by Graham Macklin sort of puts forward. And you also have this anti-imperialist fascism, or rather, there's a really interesting theorist named Federico Finkelstein, who teaches at the New School, and he says that fascism is basically anti-colonial imperialism, where you can't separate the imperium from fascism, but you can sort of create that break from the old school colonialism to this sort of like idea of the expansion of empire as a natural instinct of a patriarchal state. And so you have through the 70s and 80s, well, and even way into the 50s, this fascist tendency to support national liberation states and be supported by national liberation states, like Nasser in Egypt, for example. And so going into the 80s, you have fascists appealing to leftists through this kind of sense of anti-liberalism, which is almost always lodged within at least an implicit anti-Semitism. So you find a lot of their supposed anti-imperialism is simply in favor of these expansionist nationalist states, the Baathists like Hugh mentioned, or even Iran under the revolutionary government, or so-called revolutionary government, or Libya under Gaddafi. And they try to import that kind of ideology into their own anti-liberal, anti-Zionist ideology in the West. And so you get like the European Liberation Front, which was the leading coalition of national revolutionary fascist national Bolshevik groups, inclusive of Alexander Dugin just after the wall fell, and Troy Southgate in England. The Heritage Front maybe was involved from Canada. The American Front was certainly involved in the United States. And so, as you can see, like tracing through this kind of arc in history, you get a general tendency that appears, which is that fascists kind of pretend to be leftists. They're like far right-wing people who really hate the idea of equality, want to install single-party dictatorship, ultimately want to crush all opposition, and have this idea of autarky where they hate immigrants and they want to, produce solely for the core country. It's sort of like this idea of a radical self-sufficiency embedded in ultranationalism. And of course, they hate Jews. So there are all kinds of ways that they can sort of couch these fundamental positions to make them palatable to left-wingers. And a lot of times people fall for it. And if they don't necessarily fall for it and just turn over and become fascists, then they'll fall for it insofar as they'll just create alliances with them, they'll collaborate with them, and they'll, cause all kinds of problems by basically whitewashing genocide, like what we're seeing, these days.
You are listening to Yeah Nah Passaran here on 3CR 855 AM, 3cr.org.au and 3CR Digital on your DAB. We're talking to Alexander Reid Ross, the author of Against the Fascist Creep and Friends. In terms of the fascist creep, I think one area that is especially vulnerable to entryism as the climate emergency heats up, I suppose, is the environmental movement, especially when you've got groups like Extinction Rebellion that are largely consist of, I guess, naive actors who are sort of fresh to activism and haven't perhaps encountered entryism before. Could you speak to, especially as an Earth Firster, what you see happening with the environmental movement and I guess what your advice would be to avoid entryism.
So I just wrote this whole white paper with my co-author Emmy Bevensey about this subject. It's a very interesting subject. You know, fascists have been incorporating ecological thought within their sort of theoretical corpus, at least since the Nazis in the 20s. And it's so you could say that this is like a trend generally with like the green movement. You know, you have Walter Dare, you have organic farming, theorists in England during the 30s who go completely fascist and then become, influential members of the organic movement. You have all of these different interesting figures. Haeckel, who actually coined the term ecology and then became part of the Thule group, the cult that involved a lot of fascists, like Himmler, who was this sort of bizarre eco guy, as well as being just like arguably the most sinister Nazi, which is just like a title you don't want it. And then after the war, the German Greens were co-created by some pretty intense right wingers who ended up kind of getting the boot and then starting their own, different green subgroups. And in Italy, you have this thing called the Hobbit Camp, where they like created this kind of like yeah, I know you're looking at me like what the hell, but it's like this like Tolkien sort of like folksy outing where all these people would get together and just we're just talking about folk and myth and that kind of stuff, bro. And so there's this whole trend running through the history of fascism of sort of green and ecological intrigue.
But you have some personal experience with this stuff too, right, Alexander?
Yeah. I have personal experience. Friends of mine have personal experience. There's a tendency, right, to in ecological thought to equate biodiversity with a sense of place that is impenetrable, as though cross-pollination was like a sin of the devil, as though nature never adapts and everything is static and everything is perfect within its discrete borders. And, so you have like sections of bioregional thought in Earth First, for example, that go pretty far right wing, right? Dave Foreman ends up creating this anti-immigrant group called Apply the Brakes. Obviously there were some people who were really into Ted Kaczynski, and that kind of line of thinking has prevailed in some sort of nihilist corners of cobweb-infested attics of left-wing or post-left-wing theory. Let's see. Oh, okay. And so turning this all the way around back to kind of your question. Sorry, I tend to go on these like circular rants involving history. But, you have a lot of like people from Atomwaffen and the base who actually look at this history and they're like, hell yeah. And so they're actually like pointing to things like Ted Kaczynski, all of these other figures in the past of green thought. And they're saying, this is our thing. And so you even see like memes from their Telegram chats where they're like celebrating the Earth Liberation Front, which was, a direct action oriented group that kind of, well, it emerged first out of the anti-roads movement in England, but in the United States, it was particularly intense about massive property damage. And a couple of their members actually did end up sort of turning fash. So Sadie in Exile, yeah, they were spreading memes about Evola and all of that kind of stuff. Manson, all the kind of stuff that you see now in Atomwaffen stuff. And yeah, I don't know. It's a sort of like an open question of, with more climate stuff, are we going to see more sort of fascist entryism in the ecology movement? And I think this is crucial if you look at Austria right now. You see like the FPO is out of power, and it's the Volksparty that is in power, and they've just launched a coalition with the Greens, and they have together like this slogan that's like strong borders and clean country or something like that, something that's just like gonna give you chills. And it's like, oh, that sounds like something that could lead in really dark places. Especially when you have the identitarians who are just trying to enter every milieu. At the same time, the Volksparty does seem relatively serious about banning the identitarians from their ranks. And so that's sort of maybe cause for hope that they're actually going to be center right-wing politicians who adopt some kinds of sort of green veneer over otherwise neoliberal policies. Which will generally be, it'll probably be toothless and useless, and the coalition will probably fall apart, and, politics will go back to being a complete mess.
One thing that occurs to me is that the way that, Uncle Ted might appeal to some of these individuals is because he was also a man of action. He was doing things. He was going out there and making a difference. But someone else who recently has, I guess in many ways, encouraged discussion about ecofascism is Brenton Tarrant, who described himself in those terms or has been understood as such. Just to end, do you have thoughts on, his role and his position within this kind of broader movement? And what does the fact that this person who says they had environmental concerns expressed it through conducting this horrific massacre?
I think, first of all, Uncle Ted appeals to these guys because he is like the most crotchety, just angry dude. And his manifestos are all full of like homophobic and misogynistic, just kind of, Jeremiads and like you said, is sort of man of action, but there's not a lot there going on. So it fills people with this rage against everything in the world, against their families and neighbors and everything like that. And it's sort of like directionless. So it's just like lash out at everything, because the modern world is evil. And I think that there are, valid critiques of industrial civilization that don't sort of end up in this kind of like homicidal mania. Obviously, for people like Tarrant, the homicidal mania is already sort of front and center. So they just like are incorporating everything that feeds their hatred. I don't see. So I think that his profession of ecofascism and anti-imperialism, right? They could be, that could mean a lot of things. It could mean that this is trendy, like this is just sort of like what fascists are increasingly talking about. I think Trump fed into this because of his sort of populist politics, but in Europe, the radical right populists, or rather the populist radical right, I always get it flipped, have been sort of using these narratives for a long time. Obviously Australia as well. But I think that he mentions that he goes on these trips, right? He goes like to North Korea, he goes around France. So he's doing a lot of like talking to other fascists, and he's talking to sort of these people who really love and lionize Anders Breivik. And he's on, 4chan, which itself is this kind of nihilist cesspool of violence and hate. And so a lot of his politics seem to me to derive from a kind of dominant fascist narrative that incorporates this sort of like deep green politics. But fascism has never really been without that. And so, when you see his manifesto, it might be shocking, but it's not necessarily unusual. It was, to me, like it appeared kind of par for the course. Like with Dugin's recent book, Fourth Political Theory, he says openly, we have to basically reach out to and organize left-wingers, separatists, and green theorists, so he was already basically trying to make these moves 6 years ago or whenever the hell that book was published. And I think Tarrant in some ways is symptomatic of the kind of trend that you're also talking about, where there are these increasing threats of climate change. People are increasingly awake to them. And so fascists are adapting by enhancing those aspects of fascism that have been there for a long time. But at the same time, one of our findings, Emmy and I, was that they still don't accept that climate change is anthropogenic. They'll talk about climate change, but they'll take like a pretty fossil fuel industry approach to it. And that might have more to do with, their connections in radical right politics.
It could also this is Nicole here, it could also tie into the fact that facts don't necessarily matter for fascists, and that they could be making emotional appeals to people in the ways that environmental movements can actually have reactionary threads. Like, I'm just thinking of the ways in which environmentalists talk about overpopulation or immigration. I know in Canada, a lot of the times the way that we see crypto-fascism taking shape is with Islamophobia and anti-immigration rhetoric. And, there's not enough, this might sound familiar for Australians, but, there's not enough space in Canada for more immigrants, and what's going to happen to our forests and our water. And, it really encourages a kind of, it's emotional. It doesn't rely on facts. And it's frustrating to see when there are leftists or people who supposedly ascribe to certain forms of leftism appealing or embracing a kind of like antisocial environmentalism that really just comes down to being tired of other people and kind of like regressing into the woods and fulfilling a kind of weird, rugged settler individualism. This was something that we ran into recently. We were on a road trip across Ontario, and we stayed with somebody who I knew from the anarchist hardcore scene in Toronto, and I had met him several years before that. And we stayed on his land where he had been living off the grid for the last several years. And it was like, I'm not sure how many of those beliefs he had when I first met him, but it was like very like racist, anti-indigenous, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, kind of attitude that really reminded me of kind of like a rugged pioneer.
Yeah. In Ontario?
In Ontario,
well,
yeah.
In northern Ontario, right?
Oh, I was gonna say, it's not like a berry or some shit.
But I think about the way that crosses with like what you were saying with like the organic farming movement, or like people who just go out and live in a cabin in the woods for many years and just don't want to be bothered by other people.
Yeah.
It's pretty, it feels emotional, and it feels kind of like it doesn't really matter what the facts are.
Well, and survivalism, right? Like
yeah,
some of
definitely.
the biggest sort of progenitors of conspiracy theory come out of these kinds of like InfoWars
preppers,
devotees, preppers, survivalists, people who really, really believe that, any day now, shit's going to go down. It's going to hit the fan, and you better be ready, and they're coming for you. And they tend to also have a lot of kind of feelings about like maybe, living out in the woods and, being attached to their sense of place.
Yeah.
And
returning to a natural state of things. There's the total. I feel like this is really specific to North America, but there's this like fake mythology of like a nostalgic virgin forests, virgin landscape, man's natural state, which completely erases indigenous peoples, but also is just kind of like, it's just not true. A lot of the time.
Totally. And it totally goes back to European kind of fantasies about how they are how like European ethnostates could be created that are in tune with the soil, right? Like Teutonia, the Teutonics, and, or like,
I mean, that's the line. Pure blood, pure soil.
Pure blood, pure soil. Yep. And this idea of indigeneity that totally rules out, migration and, cross-cultural communication, and even ascribes, the term Jewish to those kinds of things, as though like the Jews are responsible for all kinds of any kind of like interracial or interethnic, mixing, in the sense that like people and their cultures live in these Volkish containers that would be perfect if not for the insidious influence of the outsider and the internal enemy, right? So, I mean, that's just fascist ideology, and they've been doing that overpopulation shtick since the 1970s, at least. Even before then, even before then, I remember reading something by Ludwig Klages, who I think was the biocentrism dude, who in the 19th century, I think late 19th century, was like discussing how urban centers are overpopulated, and the true people had to move out into the woodland areas and the fields and really learn what it meant to be part of the Volk, and all that kind of stuff, and obviously like the traditionalists and that they're all really into it. It's just so awkward when people try to do it in the United States, and I mean Australia probably too, right? It's the same deal. It's like, we settled here, like not indigenous and not native at all, and like this is completely, I don't know.
Well, so here there's this thread of, in Canada anyway, I don't know, but in the United States, where a group of hunters in the East have begun a process of self-indigenizing, where they make claims of indigenous ancestry. Yeah. So, and they did it very specifically because this big piece of forest was put under indigenous self-management, and they were worried they were going to lose hunting access. And so they basically quite openly invented an indigenous identity so they would be able to continue to like hunt and do recreational sports activities in it. And they're the biggest like Eastern Métis band in the region or whatever. And the whole thing is just like a sham.
South Africans are doing that, the Afrikaner sort of Volksstaat kind of idea of like, well, Afrikaners or Boers have lived in South Africa for enough time, so they've petitioned the UN to actually be considered an indigenous group, so that would give them the ability to carve out a Volksstaat in South Africa. It's absolutely insane.
Wow. Like cosplay, especially in Eastern. Yeah, I just realized the three countries represented in our conversation are three white settler, or examples of the three major white settler colonial projects.
Yeah, so there's this white settler colonial project, and this sort of avatar that it produces, right? Of like what you were talking about, Nicole, of like that sort of like rugged individualist pioneer who like, settles the land and becomes part of it and mixes their blood with the soil and the soil with their blood, as Derek Jensen said.
Jesus.
Yeah. So, Derek Jensen is obviously a green theorist who has moved to the right, is very transphobic, and recently did an interview with Countercurrents, which is a Nazi. It's excuse me, any fascists listening to this and who are very discerning about their specific sects of fascism. I'm not exactly sure if Countercurrents is Nazi or fascist or what have you, but close enough. For a while, they were involved with the alt-right, and then I think there was a kerfuffle with Richard Spencer at some point. Anyway, they're one of the most influential white nationalist sites, and Derek Jensen landed an interview with them. Later said that he didn't know who they were.
Hey, it could be his big break.
Awesome. All right, that'll do it for the radio. I'm going to have to chop a few things, but we can keep talking for the podcast version. So, Andy, I think you had a question.
Several, actually, but I just wanted to...
He's been waiting to ask for.
Yeah, the stuff about, how the environmental movement has to... the far right needs to make some kind of adjudication as to whether or not they accept global warming or not, and the extent to which they blame whatever environmental problems present themselves, not on, capital and state, but immigrants and preserving the racial essence and so on. But I guess Australia, all those things are, very much present in part of environmental discourse. And also, I guess, in some ways, it's slightly different to the other white colonial settler states in the sense that, it was only 25 years ago or so that the doctrine of terra nullius was overturned in the courts, which of course meant that this myth was that there was no people residing here, so there were no issues around formulating treaties or, even any form of legal or political recognition. It's only in the last quarter century that that's begun to be a matter for law and politics in a way that it wasn't prior to that point. So there's been a kind of token acknowledgement, yes, of course, this continent was occupied by other peoples, and that's significant and that needs to be addressed. And there's all sorts of debates going on now about incorporating some Indigenous voice to Parliament and so on and so forth. But the other thing that was kind of remarkable about the High Court decision, the Mabo decision, was part of that judgment was that the courts decided that they couldn't, it was not within their legal powers to be able to grant the state licence to enter into treaty negotiations. It required a re-examination of British law and history and all sorts of other things. So it's something of an impasse. But also in terms of the kind of Nazi and neo-Nazi ideology in particular, there were groups of Nazis in the 20s and 30s in Australia who wanted to try and incorporate these Indigenous traditions into their own notions of blood and soil. And the predicament they were confronted with was, on the one hand, you had the obvious facts that there were people here with cultures and language and so on and so forth who, if anyone was going to claim a connection between blood and soil, was that group, not these English and German expatriates. So they had to try and incorporate those ideas and those cultures into their own notion of blood and soil, and there was some sense in which they wanted to create or recreate some other Aboriginal nationhood in which a kind of, not a shotgun wedding, but a kind of bringing together of, the Aryan tradition and the Aryan genius with the Aboriginal one. There's a book called Nazi Dreamtime, David S. Bird, that was published a few years ago, which looks at this in some detail. But I just thought I'd raise that. But one of the questions I had, Alexander, was based on recent interactions online, but I guess the recent period is that insofar as the fascism and the far right has become understood as being a thing, I guess especially post-Trump, there's a whole range of people who are now beginning to often research this to make claims about what it all means. So it's kind of like, whereas some years ago this might have been, or this area of study might have been regarded as being somewhat obscure, there's a lot more people paying attention. And I guess I wanted to ask you and others, what kinds of issues that presents to people such as yourself who are coming from a radical political tradition, examining this subject and having debates and discussions about it with others who seem to have it seems to me, a slightly different agenda.
Okay, to break that into two parts, the first thing that you were mentioning about terra nullius and this sort of like fascist dreamtime type of stuff, really fascinating, because in the United States, the silver shirts also had a very interesting relationship with the indigenous people here. I hope you can get Shane Burley, who's another co-author of mine, on here, because he is very knowledgeable about this. He and I just did a paper for the Oregon Historical Quarterly, where we had this whole section that he wrote about how this guy who was sort of a charlatan, pretending to represent indigenous nations in the Pacific Northwest, was taken in by the fascists as this very knowledgeable sort of authority on indigeneity in the United States. And so he went by the name Chief Red Cloud. I think his name was Elwood Towner. And
I think I might have heard of them. Yeah.
Yeah, he would wear a full war bonnet and inveigh against the Jews, and really ironically say that, you know, in the United States, once the fascists took power, they would have concentration camps of Jews, and native people would be guarding the concentration camps. So it's just like, wow, you know, like that is just like,
what a wonderful imagination.
But so anyway, that's sort of like a tangent, just riffing off of your first point. Your second point, I think, was more about more people paying attention right now to the rise of fascism. Maybe people who downplayed it a while back are now saying, yes, it's a thing, but they're saying, yes, it's a thing because they have a political agenda. Which is maybe somewhat reminiscent of the third period of the Soviet Union, during which they called, you know, socialists who were not in line with the communist agenda, social fascists. So it's this way of like manipulating anti-fascism into a sectarian agenda. And I find that really upsetting and unnerving, right? Because there's this tendency, first of all, just to completely misunderstand what fascism is. You know, when I started writing my book in like 2015, I was actually approached by AK Press who asked me to start writing it. And I was like, I'm maybe not the most knowledgeable person about this subject. And they were like, well, if you can reach out to people who you know who might be like more knowledgeable, then, you know, maybe they'll write the book. And so I did. I emailed a couple of people I know who are, you know, super knowledgeable. And they were both like, no, this isn't really like a thing that's happening. Like, you know, fascism is not really on the rise right now. And I was like, all right, well, I'll write the damn book then.
When in 2015 was
This is early 2015. This is like before the primaries.
Yet after Gamergate.
After Gamergate, yeah. Even after Gamergate. Because the SPLC and the ADL had both released their reports about, you know, the fascist movement in 2014. And while they noticed escalations, they also noted that, you know, membership in fascist and white nationalist groups had declined. And of course they were consistently declining because they spiked sharply after Obama's election. And so people really didn't think that fascism had any gusto at that point. And that was where I just sort of said, all right, I'll write this because I'm going to go out on a limb here based on what I've seen, you know, and it was literally like straight out of like what I had experienced in, you know, sort of environmental circles. And
I just want to say, yeah, and Trump doesn't declare until June 2015.
Yeah, Trump didn't declare until June 2015. So, you know, when I started writing, most people were saying, you're, you know, blowing it out of proportion. You're exaggerating everything. This isn't like really significant or interesting. You're just kind of like Chicken Little. And the same people sort of came around, but they also, you know, during the Trump campaign, they were saying, oh, it's not, this, you know, what we're seeing isn't fascism. It's either LARPing or people who just like getting under your skin, getting your goat. They're not actually fascists. They're just kids who are just fucking with you. And, you know,
who listen to Death in June.
Who listen to Death in June and do everything that the fascists do. And so, you know, the research was really belittled. And a lot of people at that time who were doing that belittling were also saying, you know, that Clinton was the greater evil, or that picking Clinton as the lesser evil was itself like a non-revolutionary strategy or whatever. Or, you know, basically saying, if I, like Zizek, like if I was to vote, I would vote for Trump because of this accelerationist idea that it would actually create this awakening. He called it a great awakening. So like, you know, you obviously have these agendas of like, what are you trying to do in the world where you're like going to vote for Trump because it's going to lead to a leftist great awakening, which it obviously, like, look around, it obviously really hasn't. You could say that the Sanders campaign has taken off for sure. It did 4 years ago too. And
it activated me.
So like, obviously I don't have anything against the Sanders campaign per se. But you know, if you're talking about a great awakening in terms of people getting out into the streets, what we've really seen in terms of mass mobilization has been anti-fascists who have been mostly on a back-footed defensive formation, trying to prevent fascists from literally marching through our streets, which a lot of people who have turned out to, you know, obviously oppose fascism ultimately have denigrated, you know, and said the work of anti-fascists who are opposing, you know, the onslaught of fascism in everyday life is actually responsible for it, you know, by this huge leap of logical imagination. And so you have to ask the question, like, why are people so invested in downplaying the rise of fascism for so long? And why are they now also so invested in deriding the efforts that anti-fascists have put in to refusing to give platforms to these folks? And yeah, like you mentioned, a lot of it does come down to agenda, and it's quite difficult. But the thing is that once you start off on first principles, and once you start off on a real, you know, materialist analysis of what fascism is, what it means, then you find that these guys don't really have any leg that they're standing on, and they're just sort of like, you know, waving around in the air, trying to pin all of the things that they do on people that they don't like.
The other, I guess, dimension of that question, or what I was trying to suggest or allude to, was, you know, yes, anti-fascism, especially militant anti-fascism, is decried for being violent and illiberal and, you know, itself fascist, but there's also a tendency which locates these as being fascism and anti-fascism as being extreme forms of political behaviour, which can be usefully compared to, you know, Islamic fundamentalism and other forms of violent extremism. And the studies that are being conducted, you know, are being undertaken under the rubric of countering violent extremism. And so which tends to be, not always, but tends to be centred upon the state as being the arbiter of these values and practices and so on, and something which can be relied upon to some extent to adjudicate between them and to arrive at a kind of, or, you know, resecure a liberal democracy. The other is the extent to which that it's the case in Australia, but also elsewhere, especially within the academy. There's a recognition that there's something going on the part of the various, you know, agencies and government departments and so on, and they're turning to scholars to fund them, to undertake studies, to explain what's going on in terms, I guess, that, you know, don't adopt the radical or oppositional language that others might, but tend to present these matters in terms of this is a crisis of state management. There are various tendencies within society that are, you know, attacking the liberal order, and we need to understand them in order to better corral them to reproduce this social order. Whereas, you know, much of militant anti-fascism proceeds from a very different political basis. So, I guess I'm also wanting you to speak to, and this applies to some of the perhaps recent interactions you've had with various other parties. What kinds of, I guess, problems were presented to you in researching the book, but also, you know, engaging in public education about these matters in the here and now, and how do you distinguish a more radical or militant approach from those that seek to, I guess, manage them in a way that's conducive to the interests of those, you know, segments of society that dominate the state and politics and economy and so on? if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think it just kind of is reflected in social movements just kind of down the line. You always have elements of social movements that are attempting to draw, honest brokers into, public discourse, multiple stakeholders engaged in a collaborative sort of policy forming apparatus. But you can't really do that with fascists. And so that kind of approach tends to fall completely flat. And even when, you have liberal politicians trying to draw anti-fascists into those kinds of discussions, you tend to find pretty quickly that they're often rooted in economic issues, even if those economic issues are not the basis for the fascist problem. And I think that, what I'm trying to say by that is that, like, people who are militant anti-fascists are generally opposed to the state because they would also be part of other social movements that are, in favor of economic justice, in favor of environmental justice. They want, equality and they want freedom. And fascists are trying to obliterate them. And so they take to the streets because they don't want to see their friends being beaten in the streets. They don't want to see fascists. They don't want to see the country turn into a fascist country. And for them, they don't have they don't have an invitation to City Hall. Nobody's really kind of knocking on their door asking them for their input. And so you're talking about very alienated people who don't really have any recourse but to meet the fascists in the streets and oppose them. So it's just kind of a bread and butter type of thing. I know Hugh has smarter things than I do to say about this.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. The situation's a little different in Canada because since the 70s, multiculturalism has been such a baked-in part of the national discourse and so intrinsically tied to Canadian nationalism that even overtly racist social movements need to dress themselves up in the language of anti-racism, which can be a bit of a weird thing. A guy recently lost the Conservative leadership contest in Canada and decided to run as his own party, and he borrowed Trump's rhetoric around race and immigration and literally Antifa. He had big billboards up during the election decrying Antifa and saying that he would make a Canada free of Antifa, and he lost so brutally. An anarchist parody party ran a dude with the same name as him in his riding, and I think that dude got more votes than he did.
I think those billboards went
viral. Yeah,
went viral. Where was he at?
Quebec. I mean, he was running nationally. The party was running nationally, and they made an astonishing effort to recruit people of color to run as candidates. Canada has a very loopy kind of politics around race and racism and immigration. There's a lot of ladder pulling up and going on. But now I feel like I'm getting away from the point a little.
No, multiculturalism became official state policy in Australia in the 1970s as well, and there was a consensus, and there's some discussion about whether or not that consensus, how strong it was, and whether or not it's breaking down. But you do also have the phenomenon here of fringe parties like Rise Up Australia, drawn from a Christian fundamentalist church with a pastor who's a Sri Lankan immigrant. A bulk of their membership is drawn from Pacific Islander and other, communities, which is seemingly incongruous when they join up with neo-Nazis and white supremacists on the streets to reclaim Australia. So it's certainly similar sorts of things are happening in Australia as well. And I think that the question is, and Australia obviously for, most of its existence as a nation state had bipartisan support for the White Australia policy. So it was, very much incorporated into the structures of the state and society. And that's, one of the things that prompted my own concern about, I guess, the far right within Australia is there's an argument that the state undertook the role of implementing those policies, which meant that you didn't witness the development of a movement as you did in Europe and elsewhere, because much of that work was already undertaken by the state itself, so there was no political necessity for it. But as the increasing distance from that policy, increasing ways in which some form of multicultural or pluralist society is being constructed, that means that ground or that political space now becomes available for the development of these kinds of ideologies and movements. So I've always thought that there was real potential, along with, climate catastrophe and economic dysfunction, for these ideas and movements to re-emerge and actually constitute themselves as a more serious political force here.
Alexander, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us. Is there anywhere that people can catch you online?
I mean, I'm at Twitter on @AReidRoss, ReidRoss. I don't know if I have any. How do you get to Ad Astra?
Oh, just adastracomics.com, but it's comics with an X.
I think I have a website. What about your thing? Do you have anything to plug, Jeremy?
If you want to hear yet another dirtbag American leftist podcast emanating from the Pacific Northwest, check out Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person, Socialism and Simpsons Quotes, Posadism and Pro Wrestling. Check us out on soundcloud.com/givingthemic or twitter.com/givingthemic, or whatever. We try to keep it interesting.
That was Alexander Reid Ross, the author of Against the Fascist Creep, along with Nicole and Hugh from Ad Astra Comics and Jeremy on tech. Over in Portland, Oregon, that is the end of the show. It is subscriber month here on 3CR, so please do go to 3cr.org.au/subscribe and see how you can join up and become part of the 3CR family. Global Intifada is up next. That's it from us. See ya.
Bye.
Did you know that the KKK adopted a highway just a few miles away from my mom's house? They pay the money and they burn up the sign. I guess they dress up in sheets and go pick up the trash. The trash, the trash. They pick up the trash. The trash, the trash. They pick up the trash.